Well, good morning, everybody. We're continuing in our series about sharing our faith, sharing the faith. Last week we heard about the impact of Paul's conversion. He used his existing gifts and put them now to the new role of proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, the one who he had previously been persecuting. And salvation was now in his name he was proclaiming. It got him into a bit of trouble, but Paul was always getting into a bit of trouble. And we ended with the news that a season of peace had come upon the church. So let's read the scriptures. Let me read it to you from Acts and chapter 9 and just verse 31, and then our text, which is from verse 32. So Paul, having got into all sorts of trouble, is packed off to Tarsus, where I think the believers hope he might do a little less trouble. And Luke records that meanwhile, the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and was built up. Living in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it increased in numbers. Phew. Verse 32. Now, as when Peter went here and there among all the believers, he came down also to the saints living in Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden for 8 years, for he was paralyzed. Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed." And immediately he got up, and all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. I wonder how many of you were teenagers this week have said, "Get up and make your bed," but not in the quite same sense, no doubt. Verse 36. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Now, since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, who heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. May God add his blessing to that reading from his word. We might imagine that the early days in the life of the church, things were pretty plain sailing. But the New Testament church had its crises. Acts records pressure from within the church. Disputes, for instance, about partiality in the Jerusalem church, as Judean and Hebrew-speaking widows were seemingly favored above Greek-speaking widows. It prompted the appointment of the first deacons, one of whom became the very first martyr, Stephen. And James, who assumed leadership of the Jerusalem church after the crisis of Stephen's death and the ensuing persecution, even suggests that infighting in the scattered church had descended to violence. Those in our home group will know we've been looking at the book of James over the last few months. It's not quite the story of the early church that often gets told. And by the time we arrive at chapter 9, the mission of the church is well underway in reaching Jewish people beyond Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and where those early Christians had scattered because of the persecution that had broken out. And I want this morning for us to see that God uses our crises. He uses our kindness, and he uses our condition in his purposes. God uses our crises. The reason Peter is here in the region to the northwest of Jerusalem, out towards the Mediterranean Sea, is because a crisis has occurred in the life of the church. Stephen had been stoned to death, and a more general persecution of the disciples had followed as the Jewish community sought to oppress this new sect, which was largely disapproved of. And amongst those who led that persecution was a man called Paul. Saul of Tarsus is his other name. But he's converted on the way to Damascus in Syria to persecute the disciples there, and he meets the risen Lord on the road and is converted. Instantly, suddenly, Jesus meets him. He falls off his horse, or whatever the animal that was carrying him, probably a horse, and loses his sight. And he hears Jesus speaking to him, saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Well, Paul, never one to back off from a controversy, immediately in his conversion begins telling about this new faith in Jesus in such a way that the Jewish community gets really irritated with him, and he gets into all sorts of bother. And after he's packed off to Tarsus, which is his hometown, there's a little bit of peace. Now, Luke isn't quite saying the peace comes upon the church because Paul is somewhere else, but there's a little bit of a hint of that, as Steve was reminding us last week. So here is a season where there's peace for the church. The persecution has been alleviated, it's dropped. And so Peter is able and free to move around, and he's visiting all these little scattered groups of Christians in what is now Lebanon and Israel and Palestine. He just gets on with the mission, which is to make Jesus known. It's nearer to his home territory of Galilee. And this crisis in the church had brought all sorts of new opportunities for the gospel to be shared. And the fact that God's blessing is on this expanding mission is seen in the two miracles that we've read about in our reading from Acts this morning. The healing of a Greek man called Aeneas, and the raising of a Jewish woman named Tabitha. And those healings, together with the success of Peter's evangelizing, shows how our crises becomes God's opportunities. Goodness knows we face enough crises in our world today. We've experienced right up close and personal the impact of a warming climate this week. Those who don't normally live in this country, weren't brought up in this country, might think this is how British summers always were. But those of us who are a little bit longer in the tooth and grey in hair remember most of our summers consisted of 2 days of sunshine and then a week of rain. And that was kind of normal. So this is a very different climate that we're living in. And it's quite rightly called a climate emergency. This isn't going to go away or stop. This year, 2026, is forecast to be the hottest on record. There's a threat of war in Europe, with Russia amassing resources on the borders of the Baltic states just at the moment. And closer to home, our own politics is lurching to the far right under a cloak sometimes of sham Christianity. Those who want to, quotes, unite the kingdom. Actually, it seems what they want to do is to fragment our society and resist showing hospitality to those who need it most. And the church has a struggle on its hands to identify just where the presence of Christ is to be found. Is it found in a form of Christian nationalism wrapped in the St. George's cross, or in the acts of mercy and generosity towards the most needy? Don't be fooled by AI-generated posts if you watch Facebook. They project a message that this country is really only for white people and Christian people and a certain class of white Christian person. Well, God will have none of that nonsense, and I hope we won't either. The presence of crosses at far-right rallies doesn't mean it's genuinely Christian, as we were thinking this morning about what it says on the label has got to be matched with what happens in the lifestyle. But these crises can become God's opportunities. After I'd written the sermon and done the PowerPoint, just yesterday as I was reflecting on it, I came across an article from the Times of a week ago, written by Paul Parker. Paul Parker is the recording clerk for Quakers in England. That's the kind of general secretary, but they don't use that language. I got to know Paul pretty well when I was General Secretary of Churches Together in England. We together negotiated a way through a very serious crisis within our fellowship of churches. And his generosity and wisdom I valued greatly. I would count him a friend. He's writing about why the book of, or the register of Quakers who've gone to prison or have been to court has been opened up quite recently. Of course, in the 17th century, when the Quakers were first formed, many of them went to prison because of their faith. They didn't go to the parish church, so they got fined. Baptists were the same. And so they were persecuted for this new faith of Quakerism, this new aspect of free church life and witness. But these books have been opened up and added to with many, many, many names in the last few years as Quakers have joined in, for instance, protesting against or identifying, I should say, with Palestine Action, which is a proscribed organization under the terrorist acts, I think to the shame of our government it is anyway. And he talks about the way that Quakers have been at the forefront of putting their faith into action, as indeed we're called to. He quotes lovingly from William Penn. William Penn was that family that founded in the United States Pennsylvania. So those from the States will know of Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker. And in good 17th century English, he writes this: "True godliness don't turn men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it and excites their endeavors to mend it. Christians should keep the helm and guide the vessel to its port, not meanly steal out at the stern of the world and leave those that are in it without a pilot, to be driven by the fury of evil times upon the rock or sand of ruin." We could take those words of William Penn, I think, to our hearts as well. Paul Parker goes on to quote from James 2, verse 18. "You can show me your works apart from your faith, then I can show you my faith apart from my works. Faith and works, works and faith, fit together, hand in glove." The children learned that this morning. Quaker Advisors and Queries, that's their book of how they conduct their life, number 35. The Quakers are a funny bunch. Says, "Respect the laws of the state, but let your first loyalty be to God's purposes. If you feel impelled by strong conviction to break the law, search your conscience deeply. Ask your meeting for the prayerful support which will give you strength as a right way becomes clear. Maybe like Quakers of old and Quakers today, in the future God will call us as a church to stand up for what is right in the crises that come upon us. And sometimes it won't necessarily be following what the law requires of us, if that law is not godly. Don't just go off and do it. Consult the church. That will strengthen us if we feel in conscience that we should act and protest in that way. Never with violence, of course. Quakers never use violence, but always with a sense that what is right in the conscience is what we should do. God can take our crises and turn them into opportunities to defend what is right and godly in our world. I wonder what new opportunities might arise for us as we seek to care for our environment or proclaim an authentic faith in the face of so much that is dangerous and false. And secondly, God uses our kindness. The first miracle in this section of Acts is the raising of Aeneas, just as Jesus had done on so many occasions. It takes place in Lydda. It's on the crossroads between an east-west route from the coast into the center of Israel and on a north-south road. And this town grows up in Lydda on the crossroads. And as this man, Aeneas, is healed by Peter, the news begins to spread around the surrounding area, including the plain of Sharon, which is up there near Joppa, or Jaffa, as it's now called. And this is an echo of the ministry of Jesus. This is what Jesus did, and Peter does it. And the second is also an echo of Jesus' ministry when he raises Jairus, his daughter, from death. So Peter raises from death this woman called Tabitha. Tabitha is a lovely name. It means gazelle or deer in Hebrew, and Dorcas means the same thing. That's a lovely name to have, isn't it? And this beautiful name reflects the beautiful character of this woman, probably a woman of some financial means, who was able to use her time and money in providing clothes for the poor, as well as other means of financial support. Now, today we pop into M&S for a new T-shirt, or we order a new coat online and it gets delivered within a few days. In Jesus' day, in Peter's day, there were no clothes shops. There were shops selling food, but generally there weren't shops that sold clothes. So you couldn't just pop into town and get a new cloak. You needed to make it yourself or have someone make it for you. We forget probably that the clothes we wear may well have been made by someone in Vietnam or Bangladesh who is poor by anyone's standards, certainly by ours. And in the first century, while most people were in homes where there was at least one person skilled in making their own clothes, we have one member of our church here, Sue Curtis, who makes all her own clothes, and it's a wonderful gift to have. But the poorest in society wouldn't have the money to buy the cloth, wool or linen, there was no cotton, or to weave it themselves. And so they were destitute and would be reliant upon the generosity and skill of women like Tabitha. And in fact, the widows who surrounded her dead body were wearing the clothes that she had made for them. And they showed them to Peter and were talking about this, she made this for me. And I'm wearing it today in honor of this woman. She was mourned because of her skill, but more, she was mourned because of her kindness. Kindness is a much underrated virtue in our world, not one celebrated particularly today. It does, however, take us to the very heart of who God is. If you wanted one word to describe the God in whom we believe, in whom we put our trust, that one word would be kind. The Old Testament describes the steadfast love of the Lord. We sang it this morning. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Another translation of that steadfast love is the kindness of God never ceases. The Hebrew word hesed has a variety of meanings. And it's the simplest, most concise way of describing God's character. Kindness is the heart of who God is. Yes, he's just and he's patient and everything else, but if you got right down to the center of one word, we believe in a God who has been kind to us. And you cannot be the one who wraps yourself in the symbols of cross and flag, then act unkindly and without mercy. It's the action that counts. By the fruit of our lives, we are known by God. So Tabitha's body had been washed in preparation for her burial and laid in an upstairs room. It may even have been an upstairs room in the house where the church met for its weekly worship on the first day of the week. We just don't know that. Just note how Peter echoes the ministry of Jesus by speaking the words of life and resurrection to Tabitha. And the first thing that happens is she opens her eyes. And the first thing she sees when she opens her eyes is Peter. I mean, that must have been the surprise of her death or the surprise of her life. I don't know what. Can you imagine? You're dead, and then suddenly your eyes open, and there's Peter standing there in front of you. Now, my guess is she recognized Peter. I mean, Joppa isn't that far from Jerusalem, and in the intervening months between Pentecost and this story in Acts, I dare say she had traveled to Jerusalem and would have known Peter, recognized him. And Peter takes her hand, helps her to her feet, she's already sat up, and presents her to the widows as someone who is alive. And the news spreads. Boy, that news would spread, wouldn't it? Believing in the message that Peter was preaching. Tabitha, in her life, had helped many poor people back onto their feet in a way that she knew best, by helping them financially and making them clothes. Through these acts of kindness, their eyes were opened to the Lord whom she served, and they recognized that God was at work in and through Tabitha. Now Peter literally helps her to her feet. Her own eyes opened from the sleep of death. And in this new recovery of life, she bears witness to the saving power of Jesus Christ throughout her city of Joppa, and the gospel spreads and it grows. Isn't that fantastic news? Wouldn't you love to see that happen in Bicester? Well, it begins not with the miracle, it begins with the everyday kindness that gave Tabitha her reputation. And finally, I want to say something about the way that God uses our condition. The sign of God's merciful love and power to save in his stories is not through some social media post or even a big rally, but it's through a lame man restoring his ability to walk and a dead woman restored to life. Aeneas might have wondered what he could do to share his faith. Even take care of himself was difficult, confined to his bed. He might have said, in my condition, what can I do? And certainly, once you're dead, there's not much more you can do. And I wonder whether Tabitha, as she lay dying, wondered in her heart, oh, is this the end of all that I have been able to do for Christ, my Lord? The end has come. There's nothing more. And she entrusted herself to God's keeping, no doubt. With Tabitha's death, her ministry had come to an end. I wonder if she was anxious about who would take up the reins of that ministry. Who now would make the clothes? Because people didn't suddenly stop being poor. For Aeneas, his condition was life-limiting. For Tabitha, her condition was life-ending. But you see how in their restoration, they have new opportunities for the gospel to spread. There is no condition in life, or for Tabitha's case, in death, which God cannot take and use if we're willing and open to his leading. These conditions that maybe we think of ourselves, that limits us. I couldn't possibly do. I don't speak well or whatever. There is no limitation upon God's. Before we think just in closing about that, let me just note something at the end of this reading. And it's this, that Luke says Peter stays a while in Joppa with Simon, who was a tanner. Now, anyone wearing some leather today? Anyone got a bit of leather on them of some shape or form or other? So you've all benefited from someone doing some tanning, because tanning is how you convert animal hides. It could be, it's generally the hides of cattle to make leather, but it can be pigs' hides, it can be lambs' hides, it can be any kind of animal hide. And it's converted into leather by a very, very unpleasant process. It's an extraordinary smelly process, and it involves copious quantities of human urine. Understandably, tanners were not the people who were the center of social life in any community, because they would carry that smell with them, and quite apart from the smell of animal hides and everything else. So, But more than that, in the Jewish law, because they were dealing with, dead material, animal hides is the hide of a dead animal, they broke all sorts of religious laws, and therefore they were at the margins of Jewish society as well as at the margins of everybody's society because of the nature of the work that they did. But here's Peter staying with Simon the tanner. He's already learned from Jesus to get close to people who the religious authorities said you should shun. And in chapter 10, are we doing chapter 10 next week? Anyone? Sarah? Maybe. Who knows? Read chapter 10, even if it's not the sermon next week. In chapter 10, Peter is going to go through another crisis. This is a crisis about whether he should draw near and help non-Jewish people, Gentiles, like you and me. But it's prepared, I think, in these days when he's staying with Simon the tanner and getting used to living in the home of someone who good religious people in his days would have said, keep your distance. Religious people love rules that say who's accepted and who is an outsider. Declaring the condition for acceptance and inclusion, religious people may say you're not included because of your sexuality or your class or your race. But God will have none of that. It may be that you feel that you're limited by your health. Well, God can use you, whatever the conditions of your health, physical, emotional, or mental. If you feel your background is dubious, God can use you. In fact, God will especially use you. If you're poor, God can use you. What it takes for every condition of life is an openness to the mercy and kindness of God and a willingness to live likewise, to be people of kindness and patience and generosity. Whatever crisis you may feel has overtaken your life, or maybe not a crisis, just a lack of something, you think, well, this task of sharing Christ and making him known, I can't do that myself. I'll let others do it. Well, there is one thing we can all do. Every single person in church this morning, everybody listening online, we can be kind people. And if we're kind people, God can take and use that. In fact, it's often the self-assured and the people whose lives are all sorted out, who can manage quite well by themselves, don't need you so much, God, who actually find it much harder to be used by God. For he opposes the proud and he lifts up the meek. So as we share our faith, don't wait until you're a better Christian. Don't wait until you're a better speaker. Don't wait until you're this, that, or the other. Now is the time, and this is the place, and this is the community in which to live and act with kindness. Share your faith and witness to God's ability to use everyone, whatever their circumstances or condition, race, age, wealth, health. No one is excluded from this mission, and everybody has their part to play. Heart, yes, everybody has a heart for a part to play. Is that you this morning? Put your hand up if you think that's you. You have a part to play in the mission of God by simply being kind. I think that's a full house. That's agreed. Okay. We've said it in church. We live it this week. May God add his blessing to the scriptures and our meditations upon it. Amen.